Hello, Vernacular Faithful. Another impromptu recording. And today I have a few notes that I'm going to be following. For the most of the others, I basically ran off the cuff. But this is specifically with regards to a concept in fighting games. The idea is the Ranger versus the Scrapper. For those of you who are uninitiated, this is one of the harder to balance combat interactions in a fighting game, or rather, I should say, one of the harder to balance player paradigm interactions to that you find in fighting games. So specifically, the idea is that you have the Scrapper. The character is based around the idea that they move in close and then start throwing hands at you and putting in the damage. The example would be your standard pugilistic character who's got a duck in dash, and then they come in and they start throwing fisticuffs. And the Ranger, which is the character that does the opposite, they hang back near the back of the screen and throw projectiles at you. And their primary goal is to keep you out as long as possible and keep throwing bullets, keep throwing items at you. Although that did put an idea in my mind of when I said throwing hands for the Scrapper, which that makes sense in the logical sense. If you had a projectile character who was also literally throwing hands, cutting off their hand and throwing it at you, and doing it in that way. Anyway, I digress. This is a issue that has a lot of balance problems and externalities that can get in the way. One of these in particular is just the fact that both players can have a very negative experience when the other is performing well. Specifically, if you're the Scrapper and you're performing well, the Ranger might not actually get to play the game. And the same is true of the Ranger. But I want to dig into this to the core of what really makes this tick and try and explain why it's imbalanced and how to actually approach this in a way that achieves a certain sense of balance. And this is something that a lot of developers have approached in the past, but I'm going to explain a little bit of why some of their approaches don't quite work from a fundamental standpoint. So firstly, the fundamental imbalance of Scrapper versus Ranger can be brought down to the fact that there are two paradigms that the Scrapper is operating on, and ultimately one paradigm that the Ranger at least is graded on for victory. Technically, they're both operating on the same paradigms, but I'll explain what the difference here is. So they're both operating on the paradigm of there's an optimum distance that they need to be at to do their work, and they need to deal damage. The thing is that the Ranger doesn't necessarily need to be at their optimum distance to deal damage, and when they do deal damage, all sales are final. For the Scrapper, they have to be in close to deal the damage and then successfully deal the damage. But the thing is, whereas the Ranger, once they start at their victory space, and it's really hard to revoke that. For the Scrapper, however, they don't start at their victory point, and moreover, actually getting in to deal that damage. Anytime they try and close the distance, there's an opportunity to revoke that progress. And so for the Scrapper in particular, it feels like they're pushing a hill up a poor mountain. Well, they're basically I don't remember the guy, but there's a specific character in Grecian history that not Grecian history, Grecian legend, who is basically pushing a mountain up a hill eternally. I think it's Sisyphus. Anyway, the scrapper feels like they're fighting an upward battle. And the thing is, because of the nature of the Rangers situation where they need the ability to reestablish their best play situation, they have to have the ability to revoke the scrapper's progress. And so the problem being that, again, if the Ranger is playing their game completely effectively, the scrapper doesn't really get to feel like they're making progress. Each time they get in, they get stuffed and pushed back. Conversely, if the scrapper is doing extremely well, they get in, the Ranger's actions don't seem to matter, and then the scrapper just gets to take them to town and the Ranger doesn't get to play. So we've had a number of different approaches to solving this problem, and each one has its own individual flaws. Now, specifically with one of the first ones, the most common one, is to buff the scrapper's ability to get in. And so you give them the ability to ignore the Ranger's responses, ignore the Ranger's attempts to stop the scrapper from getting in. And so that usually, because of the paradigm of the scrapper of once they're in, they usually can just cash out very quickly and easily. It makes it feel like the Ranger has to play perfectly to actually play the game. And so the Ranger gets this negative feeling of, well, I have to try so hard to keep the scrapper out, but if they successfully guess on one interaction, I'm losing half, if not all of my health, and am in a situation where everything that I worked for is just gone. Now, on the other side of it, we have weakening the Ranger's play, and this is specifically to address the complaint of the scrapper, which is, well, if they just keep me out, I don't get to play. And so making the Ranger's abilities just not do that much damage, which again puts us back into that concept of the Ranger has to play a perfect game. If not a perfect game, they do have to outplay the scrapper a lot more. And because of the perception of the thing, when they're outplaying them, it just feels like the scrapper's just not getting the chance to play. The scrapper's going to feel like this is just unfair. Even if they are legitimately getting outplayed, they're just going to feel that this just doesn't feel good. And so, the other option was to buff the defensive mechanics of the scrappers, or just a universal buff to mechanics. And the example that I can give here, and I'll actually give a more concrete example, is parry in Third Strike. Now, granted, Third Strike doesn't really have a ranged focused character, but this is because technically there's Remy. But he's kind of a bad character in that game, and there's a reason for that. The paradigm, the nature of how the mechanics of the game works, makes it so that a ranged play paradigm is not viable in that game. And this is because parries just invalidate the parry just invalidates whatever projectile came at you. And because of the way Street Fighter projectiles are made, reacting to a projectile being thrown at you is very simple, and you just get meter for it, which basically means you don't really throw the projectiles except to get a player into a false sense of security, really. Now, I know at the higher level, people can use the projectiles in funky and interesting ways, but at the end of the day, the parry by itself, at least at the mid and low levels, invalidates the concept of a projectile game. And so these are some of the ways that this paradigm has been approached. Now, the thing is that ultimately, the flaw in all of these approaches is that they are approaching it from, well, if I improve the way that things work for this side, it'll make the whole interaction better. But only doing that makes it so that it's better for one side. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it just makes it so that the other side gets more of a negative play experience. So, to really approach this, what we have to do is we have to get at the fundamental problem that makes this feel negative. And in my estimation, the fundamental problem is actually on the scrapper side, or rather, it's felt by the scrapper the most, which is specifically their progress towards victory is imminently revocable. Whereas the ranger's progress towards victory is not imminently revocable. So in other words, when the ranger gets a hit on you, he puts damage on the table. The damage that he dealt to you is always going to be there. It can't be revoked. When a scrapper covers some distance to get closer to the ranger, that can be revoked. To the point where if the scrapper manages to get all the way up to the ranger may have a get off me move. In fact, most rangers do. That revokes all of that progress, and the scrapper is put back to square one, and they're not allowed to actually get the damage. So this is the issue. So what we need to do is to give the ranger revocable progress. Something that can be that in the same way that the scrapper can get their progress revoked, the ranger can get their progress revoked. And with the risk of that revocation, give openings to the scrapper to get their progress. I know I just said a lot there, but let's kind of dig in here. I'm going to kind of explain one concept of an implementation that could do that. So firstly, and this is to explain this, first we have to grab a couple of mechanics that have already existed in fighting game history. The first is recoverable damage. This is something that showed up in Marvel vs. Capcom and the Children of the Atom engine in specific, but has since been adopted into a number of other games. And particularly, we even see that in Street Fighter VI, we saw that in Street Fighter V, and we even have an element of that in Tekken 8. Recoverable damage is simply damage that has been dealt to you that through some means or methodology you can recover. This is generally been used for when a person uses super armor to go through an attack. So they still technically take the damage, but they can recover it through some means. This has also been used as a means of making chip damage not feel quite as oppressive, where instead of actually taking non-recoverable damage, you actually take damage that you can get back if you play the game well enough. And to put a cap on the description of recoverable damage, it should also be noted that later implementations of recoverable damage have a cash-out mechanic, which basically says that, yes, you have this recoverable damage. Yes, you can get it back. If the opponent does a specific thing, you will lose it. So you are at risk. You cannot play passively. You need to protect yourself. So that is recoverable damage. This will be applied on the ranger side. And I'll explain how in a moment. But now, we must also dig into another mechanic, which is specifically active charge. So this is something that was specifically implemented in the King of Fighters games and certain forms of Art of Fighting. It also appears in Dragon Ball The Fighters, although it is such a risk to use that nobody uses it. You could also say that a form of it appears in the Soul Calibur 6 series and to a lesser extent the Tekken 8 series, but those are more mode activations rather than active charges. So active charge is specifically you put your character into a stance and they start building up some element of some form. It's usually meter. In fact, it's almost always meter. I don't think I've actually seen a game that does something other than that. And it usually leaves you open, usually has some sort of counter hit state, and in general is a huge risk to do. However, it is a means by which that you can generate meter without necessarily doing the standard things that you do in a game, which usually is attacking the opponent, defending properly, doing damage, being aggressive, generally speaking. Most fighting games do not reward being passive because that leads to a gameplay paradigm where neither player is interacting, and that's just not usually a thing that you want in these kinds of games. So that is active charge. And active charge and recoverable health. So, here is my proposal. Firstly, on the ranger side, we change the paradigm so that, in general, if they sneak a hit in while you're at range, which is a part of their victory condition, instead of getting raw damage, they get recoverable damage. They have to do something specific to cash out on that recoverable damage. On the scrapper side, we give them the ability to defend, a similar implementation to parry, but there's going to be some specific changes on it to make it not quite as oppressive and invalidating. And we are also going to grant them active charge. But instead of granting them the ability to gain meter through this is one of the ways that they regain recoverable health. This implementation specifically encourages the ranger to continue to keep the pressure up. And there's a reason why that is there. But we will get to that. First, we have to now explain an aspect of the ranger's play. So I stated, if the ranger sneaks in some hits, they're going to get recoverable health damage on the opponent, which means the opponent now has the ability to revoke the ranger's progress, which is important. That puts us more even, where now there's an element of the ranger's progress that can be revoked by good play from the scrapper, and there's an element of the scrapper's progress that can be revoked by good play from the ranger. But there's another thing that we have to look at to even out the paradigm to make sure that the scrapper and the ranger are playing more of a similar game, and that is specifically, once the scrapper has gotten in, they have to cash out. They have to get a clean hit that allows them to actually get their damage. So this means we have to make it so that the ranger needs to do this same thing. And it needs to have the same element of risk that the scrapper has when they're in close, which is specifically that rock, paper, scissors thing of, did you block high? Did you block mid? Did you block low? And did I guess which one did I guess correctly on which one you were going to do? If you guessed wrong on your defense, I get my damage. So on the ranger's side, they need specific moves with semi-clear tells that allow them to cash out on that recoverable damage that they've dealt. Now, it should be noted that these moves would need to be balanced such that a player who has a sense of what's going on can see that they're coming and deal with them, but there's an extra element to this. Because remember, when the scrapper is in, if they guess wrong, there's an opportunity for the ranger to revoke their progress and set them back to square one. So this means that if the ranger guesses wrong on their cash-out attack, the scrapper must have the ability to revoke the ranger's progress. So the way that I propose that you can do this is by having a similar rock, paper, scissors format for the cash-out moves that the ranger throws. This is where we get to the implementation of the parry system. So instead of specifically making something that just says, an attack comes and it's gone, you make it something where there is a similar guessing paradigm. And I have said, in my estimation, I would go with the three of brace, absorb, or dodge. The idea being that if the player guesses right and absorbs a move that is supposed to be absorbed, they get the recoverable health back. If the player guesses right and braces a move that is supposed to be braced, they get some recoverable health back, perhaps based on the timing of how well they brace. We could also say that that's the parry, if you want to. You can say that's either the block or the parry. We could say that that's the parry. So if they parry with perfect timing, they get some recoverable health back. And if the player dodges a move that is supposed to be dodged, they get the opportunity to hit with an attack that would give them recoverable health back. Incidentally, because the character is a scrapper, it's very likely that this move is also going to give them progress towards their victory condition by moving them in close enough to actually hit with that recoverable move. But it could also be something where they do the dodge, and if they dodge successfully, they get a follow-up move. Now, this makes it so that the ranger's progress towards actually putting damage on the board is just as revocable as the scrapper's progress towards getting damage onto the board. Now, there's some things that you would need to do with regards to balancing the cash-out moves on the ranger's side. Whereas the moves that deal recoverable health, those can be a little bit more oppressive. Those can be a little bit more harsh, but you'd still want to balance that a little bit. But when it comes down to the cash out moves, those ones, they might not necessarily need to be reactable, but it definitely needs to be something of where the player has the opportunity to see, oh, he's going to do one of those. I need to be ready. It could be that the actual animation for the moves are very, very similar or even the same, but the actual move that comes out is the actual move that comes out is respondable in the same way with the rock paper scissors. Now, if you don't want to make it a guess, then you do make it something where the move is recoverable, in which case the ranger has to set up a situation where they earn it. And this would be operating off of Tekken dynamics, where you put the opponent in enough block stun that now you have enough frame advantage that your next attack becomes not a reaction, but something that they have to guess on. This would be something along the lines of putting them into doing something that actually puts them into block stun or something like that. As this sort of paradigm hasn't really fully been explored, I am talking in a little bit more general strokes here. But the base concept is what can be revoked from the scrapper can also be revoked from the ranger. And so that would even it out so that if the ranger is playing fairly oppressively, the scrapper still gets a chance to respond. If the scrapper manages to get in and is playing oppressively at their point, the ranger also gets the chance to respond. So where does that charge ability come into play? So this has to do with encouraging players to actually take the risks to play in the first place. You see, with the ranger, it's already there by the nature of what they are. The scrapper has to get in, so they have to play actively to get at the ranger. But the ranger doesn't necessarily need to play aggressively if they don't want to. They don't need to open themselves up to risk by attacking and possibly getting blocked and giving up distance when those blocks happen. To that, it should be noted that there is an active and passive way that the ranger is able to not attack, but still slowly but surely revoke the scrapper's progress, and that is walking backwards. If the ranger decides to just start sauntering backwards, they don't have to interact with the scrapper, and the scrapper is forced to open them up. And if the ranger decides to backdash, for instance, which is a little more active, but it's still not specifically attacking the opponent, that is another semi-non-interactive way of revoking the scrapper's progress. So by this same token, the scrapper needs the ability to do the same to the ranger to encourage them to not disengage. This is where the charge comes in, where specifically, if the scrapper decides to I'm just going to and get my recoverable health back, the ranger has to throw something at them to make them stop doing that. And it's more valuable than meter. So It's more valuable than meter, and I would think that there would need to be the ability to just, go like, okay, I'm going to block really quickly, because walking backwards has the same paradigm of, I'm just going to walk backwards, and if you attack, I just auto block, because holding back is blocking. Now, of course, if you have a block button, that becomes less of a thing, but you still have that issue of walking backwards doesn't put you in frame disadvantage. And so the same would be true of going into charge. This shouldn't put you into frame disadvantage. If anything, it might actually have the same auto block. It might have the same auto block functionality as walking backwards does. Along with this, you can have something that is like a backdash, which is specifically you get a bit more distance, but you have to risk something, because usually backdash invokes a counter hit state. So if the opponent catches you on that, you're like, oh crap. Now, we can't quite make this one-to-one, because if the scrapper is close enough, the backdash becomes risky. If the scrapper is far enough away, then the backdash incurs no risk. And it's very hard to create that same paradigm with the ranger, per se. If I had to dig into how to do that, it would be basically, you have the ability to, let's say, double tap the charge button, or, charge and then backdash or something. You do something specifically that allows you to cancel the charging action, and you get a burst of recoverable health back. But if you get hit during that, it's a counter hit state, and the ranger gets to run their game plan. Now, it's possible that you could go with it being that you go to get the charge, you do the cancel, and you actually move forward. But that means that the scrapper now has a means of positively impacting their progress towards victory, which might imbalance the whole paradigm. Just having it be where they maintain a neutral position, as far as, well, not a neutral position. They maintain whatever position they are on the distance progress track when doing this, but still regain the recoverables. That would be one way to do it. However, making it so that they can actually cancel it, move forward, and get some recoverable health back, but at the risk of getting socked in the face, that is also a possibility. So just looking at my notes here, just to make sure I've got everything figured out here. But yes, that would be the general concept. Would be updating. You would be updating aspects of the ranger's play paradigm so that there is more risk involved in their play style, and specifically that the way that they're playing the game requires them to cash out in a similar manner to how the scrapper would cash out. Now, with these mechanical implementations, the previous implementations can still be layered on top. Things like, what do they call it, turn stealing, where you're able to invalidate an opponent's attack that would normally stuff you because you've got a move that gets around it. But I think we already have a lot of mechanics that balance those out and allow those to be layered on, specifically in the idea of meter, in super meter and all of that, where, if you're playing your game and you're getting a lot of meter out there and playing effectively, then you've kind of earned the ability to use one of those get out of jail frees. And by the token that the scrapper would have a move that invalidates the ranger's ability to keep them out, the ranger would also have the ability to build up to a move that invalidates the ranger's ability to recover the HP. Or rather, to respond to an attack and recover that HP, that the recoverable HP. And I will admit I haven't thought about that particular paradigm as much, but it feels like these things would just layer on top of it and basically be the snowballs that halfway through the match will make the decision points, where once the player got the thing that allows them to just say, I'm in, or once the player got the thing that's that says, I've got the damage, that would be the turning point, and the player's response to that specific thing happening will determine the turn of the rest of the match. Of, okay, they got in, now the ranger has to figure out how to invalidate all of that progress they just stole. Or the ranger got that hit off, and that is a thing, right? That's one of the things that makes it really difficult, because if it's specifically something that steals that progress, then it would mean that the ranger's move, whatever thing that they did, it's not a cash out. You make sure that's the distinction. It's not a cash out. It's specifically put a bunch of recoverable health on the board, essentially. And so again, the Rangers put into this position where oh crap, I've got to revoke this. I've got to revoke this quickly. And the same is true of the Ranger. If the Scrapper goes, I'm in your face now, and the Ranger's like, I've got to revoke this. I've got to revoke this quickly. And so while this does homogenize elements of the play, one thing is that we still maintain the concept of Scrapper's got to get in, Ranger's got to keep you out. And so the play paradigm of the two types are still there. It's just now we have more of a granulated interaction between them. And by granulated, I mean something where you can push in a little bit as a Scrapper and get in, but then the Ranger kind of pushes you back out. And the Ranger can get some recoverable health on you, but the Scrapper says, nah, man, I've got my HP back. I'm getting it back. You got to do something more. And so it makes it so that it feels a little less oppressive. It also makes it so that the Ranger has to think a little bit more about what they're doing. Because when they go for the cash out, they can't just willy-nilly do it. But that would be the general concept there. You want to look at it less from the angle of buffing the Scrapper to catch up to the Ranger, or buffing the Ranger to catch up to the Scrapper. Because at the end of the day, it's not that their play is imbalanced. It's that the paradigm that they're operating on is skewed. So what you have to do is make it so that, as I said before, they're playing a similar game of games, where what one gains can be taken away. And both are aware of this ability to do that. That makes it so that when you get in and you get pushed back out, and the opponent starts running their game plan, it's not an immediate, well, I just lost the game. The opponent starts running their game plan, and now you recognize, well, they still haven't gotten enough recoverable health that they can actually turn this into something crazy. So I can get that back. I'm still in this. On the flip side, for the Ranger, when the opponent gets in, and I mean we already have this paradigm. The opponent gets in, and the Ranger's like, well, I'm not out yet, but we're really close. This is when this is the crux time. And what this also does, because this is something that we've seen across the board when games are balancing scrappers versus rangers, where the general response is scrappers deal less damage, rangers deal ridiculous damage. And so where a ranger is making a number of different decisions and having to make, how would I say, successful correct estimations multiple times over the course of the match, and needs to essentially do about 10 to 20 successful interactions. The scrapper can have 10 to 20 negative interactions and get 2 positive interactions and win. If we have this more evened out paradigm, let's say less skewed paradigm, the scrapper doesn't have to be balanced so hardcore that they win on 2 interactions. Now, with the ability to revoke the progress that the ranger has, and the ranger has, the scrapper has a number of ways to punish the ranger for playing poorly. And the same is true of the ranger, because the same is true with the ranger, which we already know how that works. By allowing the scrapper the ability to punish the ranger's poor play, but not just expressly kill them for it, that makes it easier to balance the 2 play paradigms. And so this is my general suggestion for actual mechanical implementation of mechanics that allow the scrapper and the ranger to play nicely with each other. But that would be it. So to kind of recap, the idea is giving the scrapper the same ability to revoke progress that the ranger intrinsically has in their kit. We do this by making most of the ranger's abilities deal recoverable health, and forcing them to have to use a more risky ability to actually cash out that damage. On the flip side, we give the scrapper the ability to passively recover that recoverable health, or rather, I guess I should say semi-passively. They take an action that doesn't necessarily incur a risk to get that recoverable health back, in the same way that the ranger can walk backwards and slowly but surely revoke the attacker's progress, forcing both of them to have to interact with each other. And we also give the scrapper an action that is similar to backdash, which is something that can revoke a little bit more of the ranger's progress, but incurs a bit of risk when it is done. And that's it. Oh, right. And the other thing, yes. When we look at specifically the ranged combat, and this is something, and I will be digressing a little bit here, but across the board, when we've seen ways of mitigating the inherent advantage that distance grants a ranger, one of the things that has been done is removing the ability to zone, to attack on zones with that. And by that, I mean high, mid, low. A lot of the time, projectiles just become mid. And so there's one universal way to really block them. It can even get to the point where they're just, did you block? You blocked. And so, for the recoverable health attacks, because of the nature of them, it makes sense that those can retain that property. But for the cash outs in specific, because they are meant to emulate that same idea of when the scrapper comes in and they take a risk to get their reward, the Ranger's cash out attacks would need to be able to be high, mid, or low, and to have that same paradigms expressed across different Rangers, where some specialize in lows, others specialize in mids, and some specialize in highs. But also incur that same level of risk. And that's where the guess right on defense, get a strong reward element comes, where the scrapper could absorb an attack, get a bunch of recoverable health back, and revoke the Ranger's progress. They could parry an attack and gain a little bit of recoverable health back, and move in, getting some progress on their track. Or they could dodge the attack, which would allow them to trade out the getting recoverable health back for just getting in and playing their game. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to interact with that. Doesn't have to interact with the standard rock paper scissors paradigm. In fact, that puts another layer on top of that. So that's something that you could explore on your own. Of maybe the ranged attacks. All ranged attacks are just blockable, and really the main thing you're worried about is the cash outs. And if you guess wrong on which type of cash out the Ranger's done, then they get their damage. But if you guess right, you get to turn it around, which is the same paradigm as what the scrapper does. And I know I've said that a number of times, but that's the basic idea. Unskew the playing field, revocable progress for both sides, active and passive abilities to revoke progress for both sides, and a similar guess to reward paradigm implemented for the scrapper. Similar to what the Ranger gets when the scrapper gets in. And that's it. That's my theory. It would require some new explorations. This is not something that's really been done, at least as far as I'm aware. If you all know of a game that has done a paradigm like this, please post it in the comments. I would love to see it. But full disclosure, I do want to implement this sort of mechanic in my own fighting game. And I would encourage you all to explore this as well in yours. I think there's something there. Well, that was all I had to say. So, this is Redcoat of Vernacular Games. We're currently working on a number of projects, and I now have a new one that I can announce, which is specifically we're working with a guy to build a card game. It's called Record Biz, and the waiting list, the link to the waiting list, is going to be in the description to this video. So if you'd like to get information on a card game that's going to be about being a record tycoon and deploying your performers out there to sing some songs, make some scratch, and win at the busies, read the Grammys, check it out. Definitely get on that list. We're doing a lot of work to get the mechanics all ironed out, and I'm actually really excited to see how this game goes because we've got a lot planned. In addition, the team is currently you can find Vernacular Games' other titles, Highway to the Moon on Steam and itch.io, Legends of Mathematica Squared also on Steam and itch.io. We also have a storybook called The Fairy and the Dragon, which is available on BookBaby. And finally, we are working on a number of other projects that will be announced a little bit later on in the year, and that's all dependent on how things come together. So without further ado, this is Redcoat, signing off. Play the games you want to play, boyos.